She finishes up. She finishes up with this thought: have you ever interacted with a chronic reservationist? The motivational root of revisionism seems to be either fear of losing power or compulsion to avoid pain, and both are pursuits of control. The reason that matters, and the reason I felt like it's valuable for us to just start there today, is my understanding of what Brother Stetler asked me to do was to do a history and philosophy. And I didn't realize I was supposed to do stories until late last night, but I'll do some. But let me just start with a really brief history of who we are. We came from Wesleyan Methodism. In the 60s, the Wesleyan Methodists and the Pilgrim Holiness groups came together and formed what now is the Wesleyan Church. We are the result of the churches. We're part of the result of the churches that were Wesleyan Methodists that chose not to participate in that. So they are the groups that chose not to participate in that coming together are the Allegheny Wesleyan Methodist, the Tennessee Bible Methodist, what originally were the Alabama Bible Methodist and the Ohio Bible Methodist. And there was discussion among all of them, but the groups that chose to participate together are what we know as the Connection, and that's Alabama and Ohio, which is now Southern and Heartland. That's just a really brief background. Wesleyan Methodism came out of Methodism because of slavery, so that's sort of just a really brief where we came from. It's a little fluid about the early days, and I'm not here to give you a deep history, but Alabama looks at it a little differently than Heartland or Ohio. The originals. Part of the reason is because Alabama chose not to participate in the coming together of the Wesleyans as a conference. The churches in Ohio chose not to do that as separate churches, and then interaction between E.R. Troughton and Brother Agin and others is what ultimately brought us together. A general conference is the sort of the body that brings us together, and that document deals with the discipline, which is our operating document, foreign missions, the publication of the Bible Methodist. In the early 2000s, the General Conference tasked a committee to revise and rewrite the discipline, and the disciplines that are since then are part of that project. They are also responsible for formulating and overseeing the discipline as it continues to give direction to the regional conferences, as well as local churches and missions. A real short history of Ohio, Heartland. Its leaders were and are E.R. Troughton was the first chairman. He doesn't like to be called president, but he was in a very practical sense. He was the first chairman, and then Dr. J.D. Young and Sam Miller and Gary Brugger and Mark Cravens. Of course, I was there then for 16 years, and now Chris Cravens is the president presently. Alabama's conference leaders were V.O. Agin, Walt Hedstrom, John Parker, and now Doug Eads. Great Lakes Conference came to us from the Free Methodists about the same time as the Bible Methodists were forming. And let me back up for just what I mean by that is they came out of the Free Methodists. So about the time that the Bible Methodists were formulating their conference, our Connection, the Free Methodists were wrestling with some of what was going on in their world as well. And out of that came what originally was known as United Holiness. They were led by a man by the name of Coxon and then another fellow by the name of Dershide. Ultimately, Dr. James Keaton became their leader. And while he was leading them, they joined the Bible Methodist Connection of Churches as the Great Lakes Conference. That would have happened. Great Lakes would have joined the connection sometime in the early mid 90s. The Southwest Conference, of course, is closer to us because that's what we're part of. It is a merging of former Pilgrim Nazarene churches, which were originally Bible Methodist, Bible Missionary churches, I'm sorry, and the Mid-America Conference, which was formerly part of the Alabama Conference. I was invited to, the reason I'm involved is I was invited to the PNC conference in 2019, and they asked me to lead them and also in that process to research leading the group to the Bible Methodist community. The connectional committee, which is at the general level of our group, approved that and in principle agreed to inviting the Pilgrim Nazarenes to join, along with encouraging us to merge with the Mid-America. So in the first year, 2020, the Pilgrim Nazarenes would have voted to become Bible Methodist, and 2021 or so, a year later, we merged after a lot of deep work. We merged with the Mid-America Conference, forming what now is the Southwest Conference of the Bible Methodist Church. So this summer, this July, that annual conference, that will be the fourth conference of the merged organization. So let me take just a moment and talk to you about how we're formed and what that looks like. The Bible Methodist Connection of Churches is structured differently from almost any other organization. And what I mean by that is the structure is the strength of the structure is in a local church. It's my strong opinion, and I think you can argue this both from the scripture and from the discipline, that the regional conference and general conferences are in position simply to support what happens in the local churches in the communities where they're serving. So philosophically, from my point of view, and this is what has driven my ministry and leadership, is the local church is the most important entity in our group. The regional conference, of course, is there to support the local church, help it find pastors, and also to involve with and invest in ministers. That's why ministerial matters, and we have a scholarship program and those things. We're investing. Our goal is to invest in creating and supporting pastors. The philosophy of ministry is different as well. And my response to when people ask us who we are and what we're about, my first response to them is we are conservative. Without question, we are conservative. But that's not our primary message. Our primary message is the gospel of Jesus Christ, to bring people to Christ, to disciple them, and then lead them into entire sanctification and Christian maturity. That's primarily what we're about. And that really matters because that historically that has meant that we have been able to avoid some of the battles that some of the other groups wrestle with. When I'm going to say this carefully, but I think you'll understand if you've been around a little while. Somebody wants to out conservative somebody else or out spiritualize somebody else. That's not important to us. What matters to us is, are we doing ministry? Is the local church reaching out to the community to bring people to Christ, and then leading them and discipling them and bringing them to the message of entire sanctification? That's our primary message. I think back to Brother Stetler's initial mention about, are we even conservative? Part of the reason for the way the discipline, first of all, the old discipline was far more likely to recommend or suggest than the new one, the newly revised one is. The new discipline doesn't use those terms nearly as much. But the other side of that is we realized a long time ago that you're not going to force anybody to be who they ought to be. If they're not going to follow the leadership of the Holy Spirit and the council of spiritual leaders and the structure of the church, twisting their arm hard and writing hard statements about what they ought to do or ought not do is not going to bring them to any depth of Christian maturity. So that matters to us a lot. Also in that is connected then to that philosophy of ministry is also the core values. And you can find all of this. You can find the core values in the website. Every one of the churches received a copy of core values a couple of years ago at annual conference. But our core values, corporately decided a few years ago, are biblical authority, authentic worship, fervent prayer, biblical preaching, scriptural holiness, holy living, missional outreach, intentional discipleship, loving community, and family focus. So those are, if you don't have a copy of them, ask. Somebody has them. We'll get them to you one way or the other. But those are the heart of who we are as a group of people. I won't say much about missions because this is not primarily about missions, but missions that were originally part of the first connection, the original connection of churches were Mexico and the Philippines. And Mexico was led by Edwin and Rita Toms, and then Mark and Melody Sankey were there, and then of course Stephen Stetler. Presently, the Muirs are there, and also David and Diana from Mexico are working there, and then Slavens have just been under appointment. The Philippines have their missionaries were people like the Renners and Tim and Becky Keep and RG and Sarah Hutchison, as well as others. The Troyers, of course, are working in Asia, and Marika is working in South Africa. Missions directors or secretaries originally were men like Dr. and Mrs. William Gale, Reverend Vess, Dr. Michael Avery, Gary Brugger, John Parker, Tim Keep, and R.G. Hutchison. So are there any questions in that material, the history or the philosophy? Right. I've been asked to tell a few stories then, and some of them I know personally, some of them I know from the past. One of the stories I love to tell about Dr. Egan, V.O. Egan, was I loved one fellow who was telling me that he was traveling with him on a way to a local church annual meeting, and they stopped to get a soda and a drink and a bit of food. And the guy said to Brother Egan, we're going to be late. And the Brother Egan turned to him and said to him, they're not going to start till we get there. So we'll just, anyhow, he was a great man. I didn't know him well. I knew him, but I didn't know him well. A consummate Southern gentleman. He just, he was a picture of the beauty of who we are. It's interesting because, and this is part of why I mentioned revisionist originally, the men I know who worked with him closely in Alabama in those early days feel like that some of the folk who are trying to rewrite him in a way that is not what their memory fits. It'd be valuable if you have questions about who we are historically, talk to men like Gary Brugger and Mike Avery and John Parker and as well as Dan and Darrell Stetler and just fish in those waters a while, and you'll get a little sense of who we have been and hopefully who we will continue to be. I want to mention as well E.R. Troughton. Troughton was he was a primary force in the merging or the coming together of the connection, the Southern Conference and Heartland now. And in fact, if you're interested, he has a book. The title of it is What Meaneth These Stones? And he writes some of the history of where we came from and the interaction with the Wesleyans and so forth. He was a really interesting fellow. I've told this before. So I obviously came out of Bible Methodist, Bible missionaries, and joined the Bible Methodists in the very early 90s, 1990s. And within 4 years or so, my name was being bandied about for conference president. So the year I was elected, this is a little humorous. Um, Mark Cravens had served as president 4 years, so it would have been probably 5 or 6 years after being Bible Methodist. And Chris Cravens was the secretary, and I was the vice president. In those days, only the president and the secretary sat at the table. And I was elected on a fairly strong ballot in Heartland, following Mark's resignation. And then conference went on, and the next day, late in the day, the next day, the second day, Brother Chris Cravens turned to Brother Mark Cravens and said, "Mr. Chairman, we haven't read the letters of excuse. So if you're a Bible Methodist clergyman, if you can't be at conference, you're supposed to send a note letting them know that you can't be there, and you know, a little bit of why." So Trouton sends a letter. It's 3 pages long. And in that, I'm sitting on the front row, get the picture of this. Mark and Chris are at the table. Chris is reading the letters of excuse that he has not read ahead of time. And so he reads 2 or 3, you know, 2-sentence letters, and then he starts in on Trouton's epistle. And he reads about halfway through the first page, and what Trouton's doing, he's counseling the conference not to vote for me. He doesn't mention my name, but it's clear who he's talking about, because he talks about this guy that you don't want to vote for somebody who's not a historic Bible Methodist. You don't want to vote for some guy that's going to bring some other philosophy in, and he's he's waxing eloquent about why they shouldn't vote. Well, I'm already elected. It's too late. And so Chris, about halfway through the first page, he stops reading and he turns to Brother Mark and he said, "Mr. Chairman, I don't think we need to finish this letter, do we?" And of course, they're both embarrassed. And I'm laughing because I know Trouton really well. So they finally obviously quit reading his letter. And interesting, because 2 days later, my phone rang, and Trouton, he was not at conference. He was already in Idaho by that time. He calls and says, oh, Sams, I am so embarrassed. I did it again. I put both feet right in my mouth." And we've laughed. We've had good fun about that since, but that's classic Trouton. He has an opinion whether anybody wants it or not. And if you ever get to him and talk to him, he'll give it to you, I promise. In fact, he wrote me when I was still editor of the Bible Methodist. I shouldn't get into these too deep. So Brother Stetler, stop me when you need me to quit. But he wrote an article for the Bible Methodist on what we were doing wrong about not planning churches properly and so forth. And he used the Bible missionary. He used them as a model. And in fact, he talks about them in this article, and he gave it to Brother Avery, who at that time was the connectional chairman, and then he sent a copy to me. Well, Avery talked to me about it, and I said, "I'm not printing that." And a few months later, I got a call from Trouton, and he said, "Sams, I haven't seen my article in the paper yet." And I kind of chuckled, and he said, "Oh, you're not going to put it in, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Why not? It's good stuff." And I said, "Because most of the information you have about this sister denomination is not accurate. It's I can tell you it's not accurate." Oh my. So he's been fun to work with. He's a great guy, loves God, loves the church, but he's unique. I was asked to do a couple of other stories. One of them is Brother Bruger. So let me just stop here and say this to the young guys, particularly, and some of them are not here, but they'll connect later. Heartland, Ohio Heartland, a number of years ago, did a 3 DVD set called Our Story. It's on DVD. In fact, I just packed some copies of it just a few days ago. But last year, Jared Gardner captured that stuff off of DVD, and it's available digitally. I think Brother Johnson has it. If he doesn't, I know Jared Gardner can get it. If anybody's interested in those, it's a fairly lengthy, but it talks about, we interview the former conference presidents, as all of them that we could, and have some statements from them. We also, probably from my point of view, as valuable as all the conference presidents, is one of those DVDs. Now, of course, it's digital, but one of those, there's significant content on there interviewing Dr. William Gale, who was our first. He served as a mission secretary for twice for Bible Methodist Missions, and just some incredible information there about Gales. But Brother Johnson was talking to me last night, and he said, I want you to tell the story about Bruger. And so Gary Bruger was a strong, passionate, beautiful believer, a strong leader. If you meet him today, he's had a hit a stroke several years ago, and it just makes my heart ache to watch him, because I know who he was. He and I spent lots of hours together. But he was an amazingly gifted man. And Brother Johnson asked me to tell this briefly about his call to preach. Gary was a very good baseball player. He was on the varsity of his high school team, played baseball all across central southern Ohio, and was far from God most of his teen years. But I'm sure it was his senior year in high school. The church had revival. His mother was a strong believer, and through her influence, he came to revivals and he got saved. And he said, I felt strongly that God called me to preach. He said a few days later, when I was in class in high school, and he said, the intercom in the room I was in called out and said, Gary Bruger, we want you in the office. There's somebody here to meet you. And Gary said, I left class and walked down the hall and walked into the office, and the principal introduced me to a scout for, I think it was the Phillies, the Philadelphia Phillies. I know it was one of the teams in Pennsylvania. And the fellow sat down with Gary and he said, Gary, I have in my briefcase a contract for you to play for the Phillies. And Gary said, I said to him, don't even open your case. And the guy said, listen, we can make this work. We want you to play baseball for us. And so Gary told him that he'd gotten saved and that God had called him to preach, and that he wasn't going to play baseball. He was going to go to Bible college and study for ministry. Gary said the fellow turned to him and said, listen, can I talk to your priest or your rabbi or whoever is over you? Let's get you a 20-year extension. You can play baseball for 20 years and then preach the rest of your life. Gary said, I said to him, no, don't even open your case. Now, a little while back, a few months ago, he and I were talking about this, and he said, Claire, I wish I'd have seen that contract. I'd like to know what it was worth. But he said, I knew myself well enough to know that likely if I saw it, the temptation of that would be so strong that I would turn away and play ball. He loved to play baseball. It's amazing because Gary also, while at God's Bible School, worked at Christ Hospital. And he was working for a consortium of Jewish doctors. And the head doctor there came to him one day and said, Gary, we've gotten together, my guys and I, we've gotten together and we're offering you a medical scholarship. We want you to study to be a doctor, and we'll pay for it. All you have to do is go to class. And Gary said, no, I'm called to preach. And the guy said, you know what? You could be a medical missionary. You could do medical work as well as preach. And Gary resisted that. He also was in one of his early churches, I think it was maybe his first church, he worked in a bank, and they offered to pay for him to go back to college in business and to become a banker. So that's a short, interesting to know a guy who had those kind of incredible opportunities, but chose to follow Christ. And still today, he's a passionate Christian. He walks with a tall cane. He pastors a little mission in Columbus, Ohio, and every week they're out on the street with a prayer booth, praying with people, inviting them to Jesus. So I just consider my friendship with Gary deep and rich. Brother Stetler asked me to tell one more, and then if you have questions, I'll do them. But one of the sort of pivotal points in my ministry with the Bible Methodist is we had left the Bible missionaries, of course, I mentioned that, and we attended. Some of us were attending the Heartland ministerial. And while there, one day after the service, there were a group of guys, I don't know, 7 or 8 fellows that were about my age, and they'd all come from either the Bible missionaries or some other place where there'd been pain. And they're all standing around talking about how much pain there was and how disappointed they are. And you guys haven't been through this, but I think you can imagine in your mind's eye, they're sharing their war stories, their wounds. And the Holy Spirit just very clearly said to me, Claire, this is enough of this. You need to find someplace else to be. I walked out the side door of that building, that auditorium, and when I stepped out, Mark Cravens and Chris Cravens were in a car together. They were just backing out of the parking spot, and they saw me and waved at me, and I said, hey guys, where are you going? And they said, we're going to go to the bookstore. You want to go with us? So here's this whole guy, and I'm invited. Chris was just out of school. He was in his first church. Mark was fairly young as well. They invited me in to that car, and that afternoon was pivotal for me because I went from a group of guys who were sharing their wounds from the past to 2 young men whose lives were, I would cry telling this, whose lives were just richly occupied with doing ministry. They were talking about buying buses, discipling people, bringing new people to Jesus. They were talking about the stories of what God was doing in their churches, in their lives. And we did go to the bookstore, but we didn't spend any time buying books. My soul was feeding because I was sensing the heart of who Bible Methodists are. And one of the beauties that I've seen God help us to continue to do is keep that passion. Not every church has found, have people that have gotten saved recently, but one of the passions of who we are as a group of people are bringing people to Jesus and celebrating that. I remember years ago coming to conference and having just had a brand new family saved out of Jehovah's Witness, and went to my leader and said to him, told him a little bit about what was going on. I don't know what was going on in that fellow. He's a good man, but I don't know what was going on in his mind. But he very casually said to me, that's nice, and turned and walked off. My heart ached because I was wanting somebody to affirm the fact that God was actually working in my church. And one of the joys of being Bible Methodist is that affirmation is continued, and it is the core of who we are. So thanks, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Brother Sams. I really appreciate that. And that story, my heart just stands up and says, yes, that's me too. That's what I love about being here, and that's what I aspire to see continue. So thank you for sharing that. You guys have questions that you want to ask regarding kind of the stories that other stories that kind of shape our values and inform or feed those values. Anything you want to ask about, I'd be happy to. I'm sure Brother Sams would be happy to share. Um, and just as a way of while you're thinking about it, I'll share the short version of some of what Brother Sams was talking about earlier. In those days where there was a lot of come out and put out, where my grandfather was put out of the Free Methodists because he was concerned. He joined and signed a letter concerned about the decline of standards issues and things like that, and they pulled his credentials along with everybody else on that. And so some people were put out of their churches, and some came out. And in those days, there was a lot of centralization telling people what they could and could not do in certain ways. And so conservative churches wanted to support conservative missionaries, and the general church, the central church organization said, no, you can't do that. You have to just give. You will give, and then we'll divide it. And if you don't, we'll come take your property, like that kind of stuff, because the central church held all of the power, and they held the deeds and all of that kind of stuff. And so that's where some of that, and that's what I told those guys when I spoke with them then, is you have to understand that that's not about being squishy or being not conservative. That's about trying to be faithful to local church autonomy and local church control. And is that your understanding, Brother Sams, of what that is?
Exactly. In fact, and one of the reasons I mentioned that there's a lot of strength in the local church. That's on purpose. The structure, our structure is on purpose. The normal path of an organization is to move towards central direction and strength, and that happens, and it has happened. I've watched it happen in my time in leadership of the Bible Methodists. We're doing much more together at the general level, connectional level, than we did when I started. In fact, can I tell another story to
Please.
embarrass somebody? My first time, as conference president, my first time to go to a connectional committee meeting, we had to pay for the Bible Methodists together, and we participated in missions together. I walked into the meeting and sat down, and 2/3 of the way, the treasurer of the Bible Methodist got up and said, we don't have any money, gave us a report, and then he said, each conference, here's what they gave, and of course, in those days, there was two conferences. It was Heartland and Ohio and Alabama. And we were like, I don't know, $3,000-4,000 in arrears. And I was embarrassed to death. But nobody had sent out a treasurer's report. There was no reporting. And I said to the guy, we'd like to take care of our bills, but we have to know what they are. I was not a happy camper. Now, let me tell you what, since then, that's changed. Every conference knows what they owe at the connectional level, but that's how loosely connected. In fact, Bruger tells, this needs to not be too public either, but Gary tells about standing at the urinal, and he and Brother Egan start planning for general conference while they're relieving themselves. And Gary said, Claire, I'm not doing that anymore. We're gonna sit down at the place where we need to sit down and talk about it like gentlemen, not like two school kids in the restroom. So,
There was quite a bit of napkin planning in those days.
oh, it was all napkin planning when I started. And fortunately, that's changed. Now, one of the things I have done through that in my years particularly in Heartland, was, I resisted the sort of push to continually move toward more centralization. And I told the guys, I said, I understand it looks to you like it would operate, more economically and it would have better flow. But you got to understand when I joined this group, when I was asked to lead Heartland, Ohio, one of the things I promised to the conference was I would do my best to maintain the values that were at the core of who they are. And that lack of central power is a core part of who we are, and it's still a very strong part of who we are. So
That's true. So there are definitely stories from those days. I know from talking to my grandfather and my dad, Brother Agan, I should clarify, that a lot of the churches that came out were deeply suspicious of any centralization at all. In fact, my first year in conference, I sat there and listened to them. Brother Hedstrom needed honestly to take more vacation than he was taking. He had 2 weeks, and that was there was a standing rule that said that churches needed to give their pastors 2 weeks vacation. And Brother Hedstrom said, I won't take more than 2 weeks unless that rule is changed to allow churches to give 3 and 4 weeks based on seniority. And because he was trying to stand up for his pastors, and I watched it get debated on the floor and get voted down because the local church was the one who needed to decide how much vacation their pastor needed. And so there could be a lot of suspicion, but it's also raised the power of the people in the local church and the local pastor, and has prevented there from being an intelligentsia that runs and decides what is best for everybody from there down. And so there were pastors in those churches, churches that had lost their property and they had paid for it again. The Wesleyans took the property, and Alabama the Southern Conference, now the Southern Conference,
yeah,
bought again their properties that they had built themselves and paid for with their own monies and offerings. The church took them when they pulled out, and they paid for them again. And
that happened across the board repeatedly.
yeah.
It's one of the reasons, I have said to both conferences that I've led, I don't know why any conference wants to own property,
Mhm.
because it's a headache, but the other side of that, it is control. And that's part of the reason that is in place. So
You guys have any other questions you'd like to ask? We've got 15 minutes left according to my timer. And if you have questions that you want to ask about other stories, I'd be happy to hear those. And Brother Sam's, I'm sure, be happy to answer. So, Brother Sam's, comment on our core values and any stories that you feel like are kind of where some of those things come from, or maybe people that raised those values. Um, and I know one thing that conservative churches, sorry, one thing that Bible Methodist churches um, have been cared about missions for a long time, and that's been something that we've tried to push and press, and so much so that we work together on that. We don't have separate missions departments only. We have a joint missions department. It's one of the few ways in which we're centralized. Is there a particular story behind that, or why that, kind of how that developed? And
well, yeah, actually there is, and that's an interesting history as well. And I have to tell this story out secondhanded because I was not, I wasn't part of those early days. But when the churches joined, when the conferences joined, Alabama was primarily responsible for Mexico. They brought Mexico to the connection, and uh, because Brother Gale was involved in the Philippines and had been, he brought the Philippines to the connection. And so for a lot of years, it was sort of them and us again. It was the Heartland, Ohio, supported and participated most deeply in the Philippines, and Southern Conference Alabama participated most deeply in Mexico. And one of the things that they realized, and we've realized, that one of the things that we've done well is missions, and we've done it together. And that's one of the places, in fact, we've talked about that as in the core values is, what are things that we have done well, and what are things we can expand. And there's talking, we talked about the paper has gone well, missions department has gone well. We're struggling a little bit right now with Mexico, but I'm not going to get into that unless somebody has a question about it. But Bible Methodist Missions has done really well. In fact, the Philippines is larger. The church number in the Philippines is larger in the Philippines than the church number in North America. They've got 4 functioning conferences, and they're planning churches at a rate we can't even imagine, partly because it's a different culture. They can build a building without hardly any regulations, and we can't do that. That it's just a whole nother culture. And then the joy of seeing us connect with what's going on in Africa, in connection with, we're partnering actually in Africa. We're partnering with FEA Hope Sound, as well as with Shepherd's Global Classroom, teaching pastors, training pastors who are uneducated. So the beauty is, one of the things that I sort of talked earlier about, the sort of division between Alabama and Heartland, Ohio, Southern, that went away. One of the beauties that I've watched happen, and I want to be careful, Brother Darrell, stop me if I've gone over time, but one of the beauties that I've watched happen is, when I first came in, there was still a lot of contention between the conferences. Alabama had more churches. They were much stronger. In my early days, Alabama was the strong conference. When I came to Heartland, we had 15 churches, and they were mostly like independent churches that had come together. Across the years, both conferences have grown and developed, and we're not competing. We don't go together and see who can outdo somebody else about who can afford what. And in fact, one of the beauties that I've watched is when Great Lakes came, because they really needed help financially. And often, in order for us to function together at the connection level, the other 2 conferences would cover Great Lakes costs, so their people could be involved and participate. And they've done that some for us as well. So that kind of cohesion has been beautiful to watch.
That's great. From my perspective, Brother Hedstrom is a huge part of the story of Southwest as far as Mid-America and what it
Yes.
was. Brother Hedstrom came out here when there were no conservative churches like outside of Church of God Holiness. And there was some kind of suspicion at the beginning, you coming out here to take our churches, and Brother Hedstrom had to go by and meet with folks and Church of God Holiness guys and say, hey, listen, we're not after your churches. I'm just out here trying to connect people. And he did. He drove however many miles to visit, and one church, 2 churches joined while my grandfather, Brother Agan, was still. They joined Alabama, Clay Center and Milton Vale. But then Brother Hedstrom would come out here and he'd visit the Hispanic American Mission and the Cokers in Oklahoma City, and he'd visit all through Kansas and visit all over the place and buy people Krispy Kreme donuts. And it was just, there was nothing to be gained. He just saw that there ought to be a conference out here. And so they pulled us in, and we couldn't pay. We had very little money and fewer people in the early days. We couldn't pay, we couldn't pay conference asking for several years. And we were so broke we couldn't pay attention. And so But in those days, Brother Hedstrom would come out here and he'd send people out, and they'd, it's just um, and then even when it was time for Southwest to form, Alabama or Southern Conference, just basically saying, yeah, take some of our churches and do this thing, and so we are. I feel like that's an important part of our story as who we are. They were very gracious to us and in ways that were not, we had nothing really to offer them. And I appreciate that.
He invested deeply in Mid-America,
You did.
time and energy, and
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And just inclusion and so many
He was an
things.
incredible guy. We know him now, and he's not all that well, but um, I don't know how he did it. He lived on 4 hours of sleep at night. He would drive uh, when we'd go to Hope Sound to meet with the students, the ministerial students. He would drive from Pell City, Alabama. He would drive straight to Hope Sound, meet the students Thursday night, and then drive back straight back home without stopping. And I kept saying to him, Brother Hedstrom, you're going to kill yourself doing that. Well, he broke his health doing it, is what he
Yeah.
did. But yeah, we were together for events, and we had some great conference presidents retreats. Um, but it used to frustrate me because I can't function on 4 hours a night. I can't even live with myself on 4 hours of sleep at night. And he lived that way for years and years and years,
Yeah.
and just
Many times keeping me from
forever.
home. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
I would go to bed at 11:30 and see his light still on under his door. And I'd get up at 7 or 6:30 or whatever, his light would already be back on under his door. We used to be a joke that you could check the timestamp on a Walt Hedstrom email and it'd probably be 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Uh, well, I appreciate that. You guys have any other questions that would come to your mind about all of this before we go?
I just wanted some clarification about the Philippines. You said Brother Gale brought an existing organization into the Bible Methodist Church.
So both mission organizations, let me rephrase that. Mexico and the Philippines both had connections with the Wesleyans, the Wesleyan Methodists. So what happened in the Philippines is there was the division between the old Wesleyan Methodist Wesleyans and what became the Bible Methodists. The primary issue there was who's going to pay our pastors. So Brother Gale set it up so the mission department, but what we know now as Bible Methodist Missions, actually paid the pastors for a long, long time, and that brought those guys to us. So there was a Bible college, and and a functioning mission organization that had been connected with the Wesleyan Methodist Wesleyans. So, and that's true as well. A lot of that was true as well in Mexico. Some of the tension over Mexico, both organizations have been who's going to pay whom, because initially we functioned like there's a word for it. Somebody help me with the word, the kind of colonial mission. So you went in and paid everybody, and then you can manipulate everybody. Well, uh, thank God we had missionary leadership that had the vision to say, if these organizations ever grow to where they need to be, they need to mature enough to support themselves. And now we send some money to Mexico, to the Philippines every year, but we're not paying pastors, we're not paying staff, we're paying to help function the school to function and various other things like that. So does that help, Chucky?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Very good.
Gale was, I wish you guys could have known him. William Gale was one incredible man. In fact, I got talking to Johnson last night and started telling stories about Gale. We don't have time to do that because it would take another hour, but he and his wife love people with all of their hearts. And in fact, Chris Cravens says, the reason I'm in ministry, Bible Methodist ministry today, is because of William Gale. His passion for souls and his love for Chris and Julie brought him to who we are. So
Beautiful. It is now about 3 minutes until ending, about till 5. And so I promised we would keep this at an hour, and we shall do so. So thank you guys very much. Brother Sams, thank you for taking the time. And
may I just pray
Please.
briefly?
Yeah, please do.
Father, thank you for the privilege of working in your kingdom. Thank you for every pastor and the churches that they represent. Thank you for the men who are on this conference call and the others who may watch this. I pray, God, that you'll bless them.
Yes.
Give them souls for your kingdom and bless their churches richly. I'm not talking, Lord, about great wealth. I'm talking about deep ministry that calls people out of a dark, broken world and shows them the light of the gospel. Thank you, Father, for young men who have a heart to do the kingdom, the work of the kingdom. And I pray your hand will be on them in a rich way. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it very much. Blessings to you guys, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.